Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our PASA Data webinar. Unbelievably, it's the end of September already. Time seems to be flying. We've got what we hope is an insightful and interesting session for you today around data, focusing on reviews, management, and strategy. So my name's Chris Tagg. I'm a board director at PASA, and I sponsor the Data Working Group, and I'll be here as your host today. We've got 3 speakers over the next 45 minutes or so to cover the content, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. Questions can be submitted through the webinar platform and will be taken when we get to the end. Please don't be shy. Let's get the most out of our panelists while we have them. So today's speakers are Yo-Yo from TPR, who's one of their policy delivery leads. We have Kristy Cotton from Deloitte, who's an actuary and chairs the Data Working Group for PASA. And finally, we've got Alan Clay, Head of Strategy, Customer Data Solutions from Lexis Nexis. And they are PASA's expert partners for identity management. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Yo-Yo.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, hopefully you can see me now. My camera is finally working. My name is Yu, but you can call me Yo-Yo because it's less confusing. And I'm the policy lead from TPR, focusing on the pension dashboard. And as TPR, we fully recognize that the success of the dashboard will be in part reliant on the quality of the data held by the scheme. So today I'm going to run you through our expectations around the scheme data and the area that we would like the schemes to be aware and why these are important to the success of the pension dashboard. So let's move on to the first slide. Scheme data quality is actually not a new topic. However, this probably is the area that the scheme hasn't yet spent adequate resource or attention to it as it should be. So the first thing, which we cannot emphasize enough, is that you need to get on top of your data, pay the attention to your data that it deserves. And as a TPR, we have already published several code and guidance in relation to this area, such as single module code and our record keeping guidance are all touched on the data quality management. So today, I'm not going to reinvent the wheel here, but more emphasize on the key actions based on our existing code and guidance. So first, you need to know your data. This including understanding the different type of the scheme data and adapt a different approach when reviewing them. For common data, you need to consider, are they present and accurate? What is your scheme specific data? Which are the key data that is required to run your scheme? And another key thing to know is that are these data digitally accessible? And this does not just mean it's digital information contained in a scanned file which your system can't read or search. It won't work. It has to be searchable and retrievable. Once you know which data that you're looking at, once you know your scheme data, you need to, those data should be reviewed and measured on an annual basis. This should include in both common data and scheme-specific data. However, although you don't miss out the key data for the scheme, but also don't measure the things that you don't need. So, for example, we know that some of the data will never change. So once you measured once, rethinking whether you have to measure it again on an annual basis. And when setting up your measurement criteria, consider what measures would tell you more about the data issues or data gaps. Maybe calculated the number of members who failed any items would be better to identify your data gaps than just a percentage of items which fail. And the measurement report should also explain the risk associated with issues identified, so the trustees can prioritize. But this doesn't say that the trustee would have forget about any non-urgent issues. It's just to so they can prioritize. This linked into the next step, which is improve the data. Where the issues or improvement area identified, we're expecting the schemes to have an improvement plan in place. As I just mentioned, the resource is limited. Therefore, focusing on the areas of greatest risk and setting up a realistic plan. We're expecting that the scheme administrators, the trustees, and maybe your service providers, your system providers, your IT providers are all working collaboratively in an open manner so you can improve the data. Although most of the work is likely conducted by the administrator, we are expecting the trustees to keeping a close eye on the progress. Last, but most importantly, the schemes should have a data control process in place, and this process should be clearly documented. A range of tools can be used here. For example, you can perform testing on benefit calculations. You can check in member data when reviewing the benefits or performing a transfer calculations. You can undertake the checks on the data received from a third party. For some multi-employer schemes, you may also considering what controls you would put in place for the data that provided by the employer. We recognize that this could be a challenge area, but there are some things that the schemes can do to help yourself. For example, you can help the employers to understand their roles and to be clear of what data they need to be provided. Have a process and systems in place to allow the employers to providing those informations electronically and at least on a monthly basis. And you can build in some validations into the data transfer process to minimize the risk of human error and identify data error quickly. So I've talked a lot about what to do with the data, but what is the data quality? Can we move into the next slide? Thank you. So I would like to expand a little bit more on the data quality. It is a complex area that we recognize, and it is not just a good data score that you send to TPR through your scheme return. We encourage schemes to consider multiple dimensions to assess if your data is good enough to use and if you need to make any improvement on them. A single dimension will not sufficient to assess the quality of your data. Some of the schemes, we know they are already start focusing on not just accuracy, but also completeness of your data and as part of the dashboard readiness preparations. And however, there are some other dimensions that the schemes can consider or use. So I'm just trying to calling out a few examples or a few approaches that you could consider. Data Management Association has outlined 6 dimensions of data quality, which I think is a good start point. And so we touched on accuracy, and we know that some schemes have going beyond their common data and into the benefit calculation reviews, which most schemes probably hasn't go as far as this at the moment. And we touched on completeness. This is where to assessing whether there is any data gaps. Are all the expecting data present? Uniqueness, where duplicate values are likely appears. For example, is there any more than one record for saver? Does the same national insurance numbers appears across more than one saver's record? Those are the things that you could consider. Consistency, for example, is that the data item is the same in the administration systems as they are in the same as they're in the payroll systems. So cross-reference them, cross-checking them. Timeliness, is the data up to date as it needs to be, and validity. Sorry, it's taking me validity. In addition to compliant with your own internal data standards, considering are they also compliant with others? So, for example, is the 2-letter prefix of the national insurance numbers match the ones that HMRC use? PASA data guidance also suggests a number of scheme-specific areas that are worth to consider when assessing the data quality, such as considering the legislation's requirements that's specific to your scheme type, and would any actions around the specific data would create any potential risk or opportunities on other schemes' activities? Does your data support your member engagement objectives? So I think what I want to say here for the scheme is you will need to select the suitable dimensions, multiple dimensions that fit for the purpose of your scheme. Finally, I just would like to emphasize that the good quality data is critical for pension dashboard. Next slide, please. Saver need to be able to trust the data in front of them for dashboard to succeed. And this is not just for Saver. The data is also critical for scheme in terms of compliance. Consider how you will match your data to the request that you receive from dashboards. When data field you use, what data field will you use, and how confident are you that the information held in this field is the scheme's decision. I just want to calling out that it is a scheme decision on what criteria you're going to use for matching. So here, our intention is to build on existing TPR expectations and driving up the importance and urgency of improving the scheme data. We understand that getting dashboard ready is a significant undertaking for industry with lots of changes required, such as data and systems and processes around it. We know that there is a lot of work, but it's also a real opportunity, not just for savers to get a grip on what they can expect in their retirement, but also a real chance for industry to tackle some of historic underlying issues around data. For example, some schemes probably can use possible matches request process to improve your data on deferred members. So we expected schemes, and this including trustees and also the administrators, to take actions now to understand what it needs to be done to improve your data and to setting up the matching criteria according to your data quality. And depends on your matching criteria, prioritize what is needed to do for dashboard and start from there. Thank you very much. And I believe I'm now handing over to Kristy.
Hello, thank you, Yo-Yo. That was really interesting to hear the regulator's view. So, as introduced at the start, my name is Kristy Cotton. I'm an actuary at Deloitte, where I've worked for over 13 years, and now I head up the data benefits and control services to pension schemes. I also chair the PASA Data Working Group, so spend day in, day out supporting schemes in this area. And looking at the next slide is the agenda for the rest of this webinar. And really it's building on what we've just spoken about and heard from the regulator. So starting with discussing what is all the buzz about data and why is data now such a hot and important topic. Then looking at what pension schemes should be doing and leading up to what does good look like. And then finally discussing the challenges often faced in this area and how these challenges can be handled and overcome. So on to the next slide. The PASA Data Working Group released a series of bite-sized alerts in June 2021, discussing data being at the heart of every scheme. And as we get further down that road to dashboards, this continues to be a really important message. So without complete and high quality data, the fundamental tasks to administer a pension scheme aren't effective. Efficiency, dealing with file reviews or manual data validation, really significantly reduces that efficiency of those processes. Automation relies wholly on good quality data to support it. That member experience, inaccurate data will lead to slow processes, increased errors, and a worsening in the confidence members have in the scheme. And then accurate benefits need accurate data. Digitalisation, as Jojo explained, data quality is critical for the success of that digitalisation strategies, be that scheme portals themselves or the pensions dashboard. And digitalisation in pensions is only as successful as the data it's displaying. So looking at the next slide, actuarial, there's data errors could lead to inaccurate benefits or missing data, impacting the liability valuations and therefore the appropriateness of funding advice and decisions. Investments, decisions and appropriate investment strategies rely on the data underlying the scheme to be accurately reflecting the scheme and the benefits that will fall due. Communications. Inaccurate data could mean communications aren't sent out when they should be and don't deliver the right information and message, really impacting the decisions that members make. And we all know that risk transfer exercises rely critically on accurate and validated data, with data risk premiums impacting the affordability. So looking at the next slide, we made this statement back in 2021, and I wanted to pause here and make it again today. Data underpins all areas of pension scheme management and ultimately drives the outcome for members. Without good quality data, pension schemes will face challenges in meeting their regulatory duties and providing members the right benefits at the right time, the ultimate objective for all schemes. So on the next slide, we look at the current state of play when considering data quality in pensions. Well, from the initial results of our survey, and that's still open if anybody would like to input into that, and our working group's experience, it's a bit of a mixed bag. So the majority of schemes have done and continue to do that data scoring, at least looking at the common data. But there is a wide range in actions beyond that, with some, but certainly not all schemes, looking further into that gaps and consistencies across all of their data fields. When it comes to data accuracy, the volumes looking at this is much lower, but the drive for this, as we've heard, is being accelerated with the dashboard requirements approaching. There looks to be a wide range in the budget and spend on data, with some citing it as a priority for the scheme budget this year, and others saying data isn't really on the agenda at all. And the level of automation and quality of the filing approach and systems still varies across the industry. Now, poor quality data and adopting only a reactive data management approach is having its consequences. Schemes are suffering the restrictions and automation and efficiencies, and errors and rectification projects are becoming something of the norm for some schemes, which coincides with almost an acceptance of a certain level of poor member experience in some cases. But there are many schemes that are telling us and showing us that the right behaviours towards data. So these are with processes in place to actively review and manage data, having a data strategy and a data management plan, which I'll discuss further later on in this session, and data being on the risk registers with mitigation plans to manage data risks, investment and spend in data as a priority, and ultimately this spend should be recouped through efficiency savings over time. And not forget data security and protection policies and processes, which will really continue to be important for schemes to have in place. You know, there's lots of personal data held by pension schemes which requires that protection. At this point in the webinar, I'm going to hand over to Alan Clay, who will talk you through some of the industry insights they have into data management in pensions following surveys and information gathering they've recently conducted.
Yeah, thanks, Kristy, and good morning, everybody. We're going to take a bit of a diversion to share some real life statistics with you now. But before I do that, I just wanted to reflect on some research that Lexis Nexis did earlier in the year together with professional pensions. And this showed us that overall, trustees were quite confident in the quality of the data that they're holding in terms of the key measures that Yo-Yo had mentioned earlier. And our ambition has been to test this out to see if that confidence is misplaced. So we're seeing here that the scores are relatively high, you know, upper quartile stuff, which is all good. But having said that, there are still some challenges. And if we can go to the next slide, please. These challenges manifest themselves in things like 52% of the trustees saying they have a challenge with return data. There's elements also around poor member engagement that result from incorrect data. And as we reflect on these existing challenges with data, I'd like to draw your attention to the bottom one, which is perhaps the area of most challenge. Because if data isn't properly managed and maintained going forwards, then with the start of the pension dashboard programme, and when it goes live, it might be this element that increases the most, with consumer complaints rising because they know they've got a pension with scheme X. It can't be found because of that challenge around poor quality data and so on. And so this will be an interesting piece for us to keep an eye on as we go forward. And the ambition of all of us, I think, is to make sure that we maintain data to a suitable level to minimise any challenges with the data. Now, if we can go to the next slide. Yo-Yo again has mentioned this. It's the challenge of what we do with national insurance numbers. So national insurance numbers are a great thing. They're used throughout the pension dashboard programme. But there's a few challenges that we've seen when we've analysed client data. And as well as Yo-Yo mentioning things like checking that there aren't duplicate national insurance numbers, there have been a small number of occasions where there are recurring national insurance numbers, but they've been linked to two different people. So that then means that there's any matching decisions made using the national insurance number together with the surname and date of birth might be compromised. So there's a cautionary note there. On the flip side of different people being linked to the same national insurance number, and by the way, that might either be a data capture error, or it is known that there's a tiny number of duplicate records where the national insurance number has been reused. We've also seen occurrences where the same person, as identified by names, addresses and dates of birth, have got different national insurance numbers. And again, that will cause some challenges in data matching that I think people need to be aware of. And finally, is when looking at national insurance number, there's some very basic checks that you can do to say that is the national insurance number complete? Because, and when I say complete, and in a format that is valid, because if you do a completeness check to say, is there an entry in the national insurance number field, it might be that there is an entry, it's not long enough, characters are missing. So again, it compromises matching decisions in the pension finder service and so on. So if we're saying in summary that national insurance number will work in a number of instances, but isn't going to work in every instance, then what are we going to do? So if we look on the next slide, please. What we've seen in the last 6 months, first and foremost, is that there's been an increase in the number of schemes that are contacting us to say, can we help them understand the quality of their data? And this helps us corroborate the research that we did earlier in the year that I briefly mentioned earlier. And the good news is that when we first look at completeness, records in terms of name, date of birth and address are largely 100% complete. If we break the name down though into its component parts, and this is important because you might use the component parts for iterative matching again that Yo-Yo mentioned in her commentary about things to think about. We know that first name and surname are very well populated from the files that we've seen, and middle name is has a much lower completion rate. And I should point out at this stage, from the reference data that we've built at Lexis, we know that 76% of UK consumers have a middle name. So, you know, that 45% is actually just over half of all of the people with a middle name have that as a record on their scheme data. But looking beyond the completeness, there's a few challenges again that we've seen. So checking completeness, as in an entry in a field, is only the first level of detail I think you need to go to. And we're seeing on average 1% of first names just being an initial. And clearly, if you're using first name and surname and address and date of birth for matching, you know, if I still lived at home with my parents, my sister's called Alison, and if you're matching A Clay and you had Alan Clay and Alison Clay in the same house, then that would cause a possible match rather than a complete match, which would cause problems. The initial rate on middle names is much higher, it's 3%. But then we also look at dates of birth, and there are some challenges here in terms of people being under the age of 18. They're very forward thinking if you've got a pension under the age of 18. And we're seeing quite a lot of data where people are over 100 years old, and our standard call out is for people over 110, because we think that if they're still paying into a pension or are deferred pensioners, then their date of birth is probably inaccurate, which again causes some compromises in any further matching. And finally, there's an age-old challenge that we wish we could solve from a database perspective, which is there will be some addresses that are non-UK, and trying to trace those overseas addresses is a particular challenge and largely results in forensic tracing, so manual tracing, to try and find these people and reconnect them with their pension pots. Okay, but if we go to the next slide, we see some further elements beyond just the completeness piece. So on the right-hand side, where we're looking at the currency of the scheme data, or the timeliness, as Yo-Yo called it, was that you might have a complete record, which is a great thing, but then when we check that record to say, does this person still live at this address, then there's a gap there. So on average, across these files that we've looked at over the last 6 months, we're seeing that we get a rate of 92% of people living as stated. Now, 92%, if you're, as my kids have done, just sitting at an A level, 92% would get you an A star, well done. 92% in this case means that there's an 8% error rate, which means 8% of people are not going to be able to find their pension, which might result in contact to the scheme, and an 8% rise in terms of customer complaints would be a significant challenge for most organisations. But rather than just saying there's a problem of 8%, through the use of third-party data, we can flag some people as deceased, and if they're deceased, clearly there'll be a separate programme that goes on to check them out and make appropriate changes to policies, etc. But also through the use of automated tracing, we're seeing a trace rate of 4%, which reduces that gap from 8% down to 3%, sorry, because 5% of the missing data can be accounted for. As I mentioned, forensic tracing or manual tracing can reduce that even further. But what we're encouraging people to do is to think beyond pensions dashboard and matching, and begin to use the digital data, so the contact data that they have access to maintain contact and to use in the more advanced matching, the iterative matching, together with using it as a secondary form of contact if that new postal address can't be established. However, there is a challenge here. Traditionally, this hasn't been a focus for many schemes, and on the input rates that we're seeing of population of these data, you can read the numbers there. So, 52% have got a landline, 28% mobile, and 23% email. Again, the use of third-party data can supplement the data that's been captured on the scheme. And I'd like to point out here that another challenge is to think about the completeness angle, because when we have analysed workplace pensions, a lot of those email addresses relate to the place of work when the pension was taken out, and clearly as people move jobs, that's an area again that needs updating, that needs to be considered in that all-encompassing data maintenance program. And so whilst these figures have highlighted some points in time where we've analysed data to give people that first view of their data quality, as Yo-Yo's called out, and as you'll hear later in the presentation, the critical element is around data maintenance. So this just isn't a one-off process. There needs to be a commitment to doing this on a very regular basis. And again, we'd like to change the dynamic of checking data, rather than it being just a case of providing us large volume data sets on an irregular basis. There's the possibility that we can issue alerts to maintain data in a more innovative way. So that's my piece done, looking at some real life examples, and I'll now hand you back to Kristy, who will take you through the future. Kristy, over to you.
Thanks, Alan. That was really interesting and insightful, so thanks again. So after we've looked at the current position, let's consider what the future looks like. We are on a journey. We're seeing data quality and maintenance improve and be sustained, and a push to get this journey started has come from those hot topics that none of us can shy away from at the moment. So GMP equalisation, that journey of digitalisation, pensions dashboards being well into the development stage, and then game planning, which all pension schemes will be considering to some extent. And as you've heard from the pensions regulator today, data is a priority for them and the requirements are clear. So policies and plans are so important, and we're encouraging all pension schemes to implement these and to actually be used and follow them. That regular data scoring improvement activities are going to become the norm, with an ongoing maintenance approach being critical in sustaining that data quality. And trustees have to see data as both a priority now and in the future. So the next slide, the big question here is, what should pension schemes be doing to not only meet their duties and the pensions regulator expectations, but to deliver that good outcome for members? So this next slide here starts this section of the webinar with considering data strategies. Now, we all know having a strategy in business helps to focus a business attention, decisions, resources, and a data strategy is a key tool for trustees and pensions managers to really manage their scheme appropriately and effectively. Whilst data strategies should reflect the characteristics and circumstances of the scheme, we have set out some key stages to support you in developing a data strategy that fits your scheme. So firstly, what are your objectives and goals, both data focused and the scheme overall? So are you aiming for buyout in 2 years, 3 years, 10 years? Are you looking to improve member engagement? What are you trying to work towards, and what is your journey looking like? Next, analyse your data position, and I'll come on to this in more detail, but independently, away from your day-to-day administration, test and analyse your data for gaps, validity, consistency and accuracy, and what is your data quality and what are your data risks. Then, what has your analysis identified? What actions are needed to improve this and maintain it? And what do the costs for that look like? What resources will it need, and over what kind of time frame? Really make a plan that works for you and your scheme. Get your data policies in place, data policies that align to your scheme and the improvement plans and security. And then bring all of this together, devise your data strategy for your scheme and plan to maintain that data going forwards. Now on to the next slide, we look at the key steps in completing a data review. And whilst data reviews can seem like a daunting task, if planned and performed effectively, this can be a really valuable exercise for pension schemes that really help to drive an improvement in the scheme's delivery of the benefits to members. So as ever, we really emphasise the need to start with nailing down the purpose and the objectives of the review. Are you looking at all of your data, or is it a focus on a subset? For example, like GMP equalisation data can be quite different to if you're looking at the ongoing administration. Are you looking at just gaps, or are you going all the way to the analysing the accuracy? And what do you already know? Is there already a category of members that is known to have data issues, or what has happened since the last data review? It's really important to understand what your position is and what you're trying to achieve. Then, how are you going to perform the review? So what approach will be taken and what tools will be used? Will it be automated analysis or using manual data manipulation? Is it being carried out internally or with help from external advisors? Is it going to be independent to the business as usual administration? And how and when will the review be undertaken? Benefit specifications and moving from data to testing benefits, which Yo-Yo touched upon, is a really important stage to be considered. Will your review go this far, and what advisors and skill set do you need to do this? So if your data quality is good, but your benefits are being calculated incorrectly, there's obviously still a big issue for the scheme there. And controls and policies really should not be missed out of these reviews. It's so important the data is controlled, secured and reported effectively. And then concluding a review of this at this stage is really important as part of performing a complete data review. It's really important to note here that a data review is an analyse and act project, and the analysis should lead to the undertaking of any required rectification improvement activities, with data being sought and validated, updated in the administration system with adequate testing and sign-off, and of course it being maintained. That moves me very nicely onto the next page, looking at data management. So it's been said in this webinar already, and I'll continue to stress the importance of ongoing data management. Automation is important. Schemes should be looking to automate processes where possible and have that good control environment in place. We all know any manual intervention can lead to the deterioration of data and inaccurate errors coming through. Periodic monitoring and validation should be in place. The quality of data does degrade if you don't monitor it, so schemes should be utilising data sources either directly or through third parties to validate the data, such as addresses and member existence. And managing data and cyber security continues to be critical. Often we kind of separate those two things into data quality and data security, but actually let's bring that back together and realise that both are really important. And by now, I'm hoping that all pension schemes and advisors have at least discussed, if not yet implemented, a data management plan. So the PASA Data Working Group released guidance on this, launched via a webinar last year, and this can be found on the PASA website. So for all schemes that haven't yet implemented a data management plan, now is the time to take action, and feel free to get in touch with me if you'd like to discuss this area further. So moving on, what does good look like? So after all the areas we've discussed, this slide brings it together and says what is good and what does that look like. So starting with a clear and defined data strategy aligned with your wider scheme objectives. A full data review having been conducted or in progress with a plan for future periodic data reviews and that ongoing data analysis. Regular common data scoring reaching above 95%, scheme-specific data scoring and an improvement plan in place to strive for better. You know, as Alan mentioned, you might not be able to get to 100, but every time you don't, there are people that you haven't got the right data for and therefore aren't getting the right service from their scheme. A data management plan and data security policies in place with periodic and ongoing reviews, and a strong data and benefit control environment with independent assurance in place over the accuracy and adequacy of benefits and the member experience. So one for those on the webinar to consider to yourselves and take away: how do you think your current position compares to this view of what is good, and what do you think you need to do to get there? So moving on to the next slide, you know, perhaps so far I've made all of this sound easy, and well, if only it was that simple, and of course if it was easy we wouldn't need a webinar on it. So let's take some time to look at the common challenges and pitfalls pension schemes can face in this area. The next slide here gives examples of challenges we typically being faced in reviewing and managing data. So starting with one size doesn't fit all, these reviews need to meet the scheme requirements, and a flexible and tailored approach is often essential. How you would review a scheme with 50 members would be very different to 10,000 members. How you'd analyse data for active members differs to a scheme with predominantly pensioners. And that really needs to form part of the approach that you're taking. That disruption to business as usual is so often a consequence which needs to be actively managed, ensuring those business as usual activities continue unimpacted by the data reviews is critical. You know, we shouldn't see SLAs dropping because the focus has moved to data analysis. And this can often be managed through separation of teams as independent advisors coming in, but with a collaborative working approach between those teams, and of course a clear and robust audit trail where data changes are being made and they're filtering into the ongoing administration system. Independent assurance of data quality and benefit accuracy is important. Marking your own homework really diminishes the benefits of the exercise, but advising the teams should be collaborative in their approach and to deliver those data improvements effectively. Pragmatism. There is definitely scope and perhaps in some instances a need for pragmatism when it comes to seeking out data accuracy. Schemes should take all reasonable steps to review, validate and correct data issues, but there will be considerations on when those steps go from reasonable to unreasonable, either at the detriment of the focus of resources and also in consideration of the value of the data itself that you're trying to source. And another example here is resource. There is an industry-wide issue with resourcing as the impact of undertaking GMP equalisation projects has begun to materialise. It's really important that schemes work with their advisors and teams to ensure the right resources are in place and they are directed to the right priorities at the right time. So on to the final slide here, and I'll conclude the webinar. We're talking to you about what is PASA doing to help. So Deloitte are PASA's expert knowledge provider for data, and alongside the Data Working Group, we are working hard to deliver support to the industry in this area. Regular publications are being released, trying to cover a wide range of topics where data is an important aspect. The PASA website holds all of these, so there's an ease of access to refer to these at the right time for you. We are presenting at and holding conferences, webinars, other interactive forums to expand our reach across the industry and try to really engage with a wide range of stakeholders and seek that input from you too. This webinar will be followed up in a couple of months with a more formal guidance on data strategies and reviews to support schemes in navigating through this process. And of course, please do feel free to reach out directly either to me or anybody else at PASA or in the Data Working Group if you'd like to discuss data for pensions. Proud to admit it's a topic I could discuss all day. And on that final note, I'll open up the webinar to any questions, which Chris will lead us through.
Thank you very much, Kristy and Alan and Yo-Yo. We have had a few questions come in so far. If anybody has any more, then don't be shy. Please stick them in the questions section on the webinar. Before we do take questions, just a couple of other bits for PASA that are coming up. We've got a hybrid event with NextGen on the 27th of October at 5 p.m. Called Let the Robots Set You Free. So that's open to attendance in person and virtually. We are at the PLSA conference at stand number 827. We're playing our usual PASA bingo, so please come along, visit our supporters, get your stamps on your card and hopefully win a nice prize. And just finally, our conference for 2023, we've got to save the date for the 2nd of May, and details of the conference are currently being worked on. So now we've got that bit out of the way, I'll start with Yo-Yo. Please. A word of caution first. There was a note to say that where you don't expect data to change, sometimes it does. So national insurance number, for example, there's always human error. Things can get overwritten in the system and that kind of thing. So just take a little bit of caution there. When you're talking about presence of data rather than accuracy, is there a plan for TPR to start to monitor accuracy? And are there any expectations at that point of what a reasonable time, effort, resource spend for trustees is to meet those requirements?
Thank you, Chris. So yes, as I kind of like mentioned in my presentations, is good data quality necessarily means the good data score that you send to us through the scheme return. So we realize the data score currently only measured the completeness part. So we are considering putting some guidance around the accuracy at the moment. So this is, I'm keen to understand your views about the data accuracy as well, so we can build in the best practice into our guidance to help to support the industry for future. So this is some work under consideration. But I want to say that also, as I mentioned in my presentations, there are works the schemes can do. It's mainly very important. We're expecting the schemes to have the data control process in place, as Kirsty mentioned, that there are works you can do to put into measured accuracy, because the accuracy is also very important for the success of the dashboard. So it's not, dashboard doesn't end up when you finding the individuals. It's also about to submit the data to the individuals correctly, the accurate data. So it is something that we are looking at the moment. And the schemes that I noticed in the question, there is a what is the reasonable effort for the schemes. Again, there are some examples that we could think in some easy ones. You can use the identity verifications to confirm date of birth. That's kind of like a very simple task. But there are some other items that probably require multiple inputs, and so it will be probably a bit challenge. And so this is where the area we want the schemes to looking at. So for example, the DC value data probably depends on the contribution being made and their investment returns, such as that. So the schemes can start looking at those ones. So I think one of the examples are that they can do sample testing about their benefit calculations. So that's something I think the schemes should start and pay some attention to it. I hope that answered the questions here.
I think it did for me, but yes, thank you very much, Yo-Yo. Alan, one for you. So we've got quite long established processes for effectively tracing people, verifying who they are, where they live, that kind of thing. But more and more we're starting to communicate digitally. Are there any kind of reputable organisations, methods for populating that digital data?
Listen, it would be unfair of me to start naming names on here. That's a discussion we should take offline with the person asking the question. But there are a few things that we think are really important when assessing which sources to use. And the first is how the data has been collected. So number one, is it a prize draw form, in which case you might get people putting any phone number down and any other information, so that information may be more or less accurate, and it's really hard to tell which one of those it might be. But our approach at Lexis is to take a number of different sources, because what that gives is corroboration. And if you're seeing a consistent name, address, phone number and email combination, and you can relay back to users of that information when we pass it on that we've seen this number 6 times, and it's got that level of corroboration, then that gives further credibility to the use of that information. There was some hesitancy in using that information by a number of schemes, but they're now saying that because once contact has been established, they already have very good authentication processes. So it's very unlikely that somebody would get access to personal information through the misuse of incorrect data. And there's finally another piece that we're tracking, which is the fraud related to the use of an email address. And in this case, we've got scores that can be appended to any email address that we've seen in our network to say, has it ever been used fraudulently? And this is all a consortium network that people can access, schemes can access, to get that further view as to whether an email might be trusted. So I hope those are a few pointers as to what you might look for in terms of deciding which sources of data that you might use for email and mobile.
Okay, thank you. Couple for you, Kristy. First one is, you mentioned there's some updated guidance coming out. Is there anything revelatory or any curveballs expected to be in that, or is it building on the foundations we've already had?
Yeah, it's building on the foundations that's in this webinar. We do want to include in there some kind of examples. You'll recall from other PASA guidance that goes out is that giving some kind of examples around scheme circumstances that you can put that into practice is really helpful. And we've found feedback from guidance before that's a really key part of those. So there will be some examples that come through in there that try to put this into practice. But really the guidance will be based on what you've seen today, just with a bit more information to support that.
Okay, thank you. And there are going to be occasions where we just can't fundamentally find the data that we need. What considerations are there for effectively how you treat those members, what you do, any steps you can take when you find yourself in that situation?
Yeah, and that absolutely is something that we need to accept in industry. If you think about some of these schemes, I've seen schemes go back to the 1940s. It's that data just won't be available. I suppose the first stage is to make sure that, as we said before, you've taken reasonable steps to confirm that data isn't available, or at least isn't easily available. So you need to make sure that you've got there, you've exhausted thinking about what archive files you have, or what historic systems or historic holders of data there were. And then when you do get to a point where it's not available, and the examples I've typically seen is like service history or contribution history from a really long time ago. Of course, yeah, once it's not available, you can't do much. There is a reliance on what you do hold. And I think a lot of the data that you do hold, hopefully will be able to flag if you do benefit testing that this doesn't quite add up. But you've got to just go with what you've got. So once you haven't got any access to data, you've kind of got to accept that and move on and do what the best you can with the data that's available.
Okay, thank you. A couple here that I'll just throw open to all three of you, because you might have different answers. From what you've seen, are there any particularly common themes where data is poorer than you might expect? Obviously, you've got obvious things like address and that kind of thing, but moving on to scheme-specific type information, is there anything in there that you see as common problems across most schemes?
I mean, I'm happy to go first, and the first one of my experience probably leads on to what Alan will say, which is that contact detail beyond an address. I think unless the scheme has got its own platform which requires email addresses to access it, I think historically a really data item that's poor for a lot of schemes. I think there's also a little bit of concern, particularly for the older generations, that giving out that information has risks associated with it. So we need to kind of change that mindset around. It's really important that your scheme can contact you and stay in touch with you and doesn't lose touch for you moving addresses 3 times in the last 10 years. And then secondly, my other experience, I think, is spouses' details. It tends to be something that is either calculated at the start, you know, in a very general way, or not at all, and it's never really thought about until you get to that end game when it's really important, and it tends to be left to the last minute, and there's lots of racing around trying to get that data improved. So I think, again, remembering that whatever your objectives are and what your journey looks like, that's what your data focus needs to be, not the here and now. What do you need right now to write to members, but what do you need in order to have that ongoing journey with your scheme and ultimately get to where you're trying to get to.
Yeah. I think just to add to that, there's a piece around the use of third-party data to fill in some of those gaps. And just to be really clear, what we're saying is that that information is probably best held as a shadow record, and you shouldn't just overwrite the initial record until that's been corroborated by the pension member themselves. So, for example, we wouldn't recommend updating a date of birth, but flagging it to say this date of birth might be wrong and deciding what you can do that way. Now, that's very different in terms of running data matching programs, because that can be done at scale on both the raw input data and also the shadow data. And that helps reduce the number of possible matches to give some more authority to that and provide the right information back. But I completely agree with Kristy on it is that contact data that we see as the worst populated.
And I probably I would echo that, and I think I'll probably emphasize another point from the savers perspective. What we're seeing is, and from savers, when they getting to looking for their schemes or trying to find their schemes, sometimes they don't really aware whether that is because it's a poor quality or is because they're wrong. That is because their understanding probably is different with what the schemes getting them, so record on them. So it could be they're different scheme names, a little bit difference, or the employer's name has changed and that record hasn't been updated or has been updated where the saver's not aware. So I think from savers' perspective, from the regulator, we would like to see the schemes be able to explain to the savers on that element. So maybe not necessarily is the poor data record, but it's more about the history of it, and then to make savers understanding that change.
Okay, thanks all. Quite a direct and hopefully simple one, which I'll aim at Alan. Have you got any recommendations for finding missing NI numbers?
I was hoping for an easier question than that. If only the government would play nicely, and they said in the National Data Strategy that they'd start releasing things like national insurance number. That's not going to happen, we now hear, or at least that's the latest. And if, with the lack of that file, there are huge challenges in trying to be able to do it at scale. You know, be very happy to hear from my colleagues on the panel if they've got any revolutionary ideas of how you can check those national insurance numbers. But until the government do release that file for all UK citizens, then it's going to be a challenge. Okay,
thank you. Slightly provocative question now, which I'll let any of you who are brave enough to answer tackle. So where, Kristy, you talked about kind of corroboration of data from independent third parties and things, does the panel have a view at all on whether it's best to do data cleansing through an incumbent administrator or to engage a third party, all up to that point independent from the process?
I can start. So I think there is a real importance of having some independence in this process. I think if it is the administration team that run the day-to-day tasks of that scheme, you have a big conflict of not only interest but priorities. Interest in that if you are doing that day to day and then you try to check your process, you're only blindsided by what you do. And also, you know, again, that diversion of focus from that ongoing administration. But then the independence question, then whether it's just a separate team within the administration house that you use or an independent advisor separately, really comes on to what you're trying to achieve, what your objectives are, and what your risk elements is. I think there's benefits in both. And I think both approaches can work. You've got to work with your advisors on what they're offering, or your other advisors and what those are, and really get the best fit for you. What is the approach that they will take? What are the tools it is that they're using? What are the costs, of course? What are the timeframes and resources, and get the right strategy for you.
Okay, thank you. Yo, if I could just turn back to you for a minute. So obviously there's the record keeping requirements in place. What actions might the regulator take if schemes are not taking kind of due diligence and putting plans in place to manage their data?
Yeah, so as I said, we as a dashboard, from dashboard perspective, we do thinking that the data management is the data quality is very crucial to the success. So we are currently working on our compliance and enforcement policy, and which we looking to publish our consultations in middle of November. And within this compliance and enforcement notice, we have developed several core principles to providing the clarity to the industry on our priorities and the considerations and the guidance for our, what approach we will take. One of these principles, it is that we are focusing on the data quality, which is held by the scheme. So we are try to working proactively with the industry to, so for example, with PASA to promote the dashboard awareness and to emphasize the importance of the data, working on the data. We will write to all the pension schemes at least 12 months ahead of their connection deadline, and probably at several further points ahead of their deadline, to reminding them and including a call to action to ensure that the data they use to matching people and then to return to the request pension value, required pension value is accurate and complete. And so, well, our view is by setting a clear expectations in this area, we will then have a very low tolerance of willful or reckless non-compliance, and we will considering using our powers if the scheme is not taking any actions, and for them to looking at their data and preparing for the dashboard.
Okay, thank you. Conscious we're coming up to the end of our allotted hour. So I'd like to say thank you again to the panelists, to Kristy, to Alan and to Yo-Yo. I've certainly found it very interesting. There's lots of things that schemes should be thinking about if they're not already doing around the reviews and the strategies and having plans in place for making sure that data is a priority. Final point for me would be that I would encourage trustees and sponsors to see data as an investment and not as a cost. So the more you can invest in your data, the simpler other processes become. Goes back to what Kristy was saying about the foundation of pretty much everything you do in a scheme being the data that you've got access to. And just a reminder to continue to engage with PASA. There are lots of resources out there around data and various other sources. But beyond that, I'll leave you all to enjoy the rest of your day and hopefully you have a nice weekend. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.